Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and thank you for joining me. I'm continuing in Romans chapters 5 through 8. We've been looking at this as a set of texts, a section in the book of Romans in which Paul is trying to help the Roman believers become stable in their relationship with God, not vacillating, not worried about whether or not their relationship with God is secure or certain. And some of that in the earlier sections had to do with the problem of the sin nature. The last sections here have to do with just a myriad of other things, such as persecution and hardship, that we might be thinking maybe those are because my relationship with God is in jeopardy. And think about, there's lots of Christians out there that are under the mindset that if their relationship with God is great, if it's everything it should be, I shouldn't be having problems, or my problems should just be very minor. And nothing is further from the truth. Jesus Christ himself promised the disciples in John 16, he said that the world would persecute them, that the world would hate them. At the end of chapter 15, he says, if they liked me, they would have liked you. But if they hated me, they'll hate you. And this is the promise that Jesus left his disciples there in the upper room. And so likewise, Paul tells us something very similar. And we were looking yesterday at the fact in verse 35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? In other words, what can get him to stop interceding for us? This is what he was talking about at the end of verse 34, as well as the fact that he sits at the Father's right hand, and in the Father's right hand is where you and I are sitting. That's where we're free of condemnation. And who can separate us from that love? What can get him to stop loving us in that way of being the position where we are and of interceding for us? And by the way, his intercession, it's always sure. I ask for things, God doesn't give them to me because they're not things that he wants me to have. They're not part of his will. But everything that Christ asked, everything he asked was in the will of God. Yeah, everything. And he tells us that in John 11 and John 12. Before he raises Lazarus, he says, I know, Father, you always hear me. And that's just not that, I'm talking. It's that hears with the sense that you always respond positively. And so he lists a number of things over here in Romans 8:35. Who shall separate us from the love of God? And it's interesting that he starts with this who. Doesn't say what, but who. And I believe it's because it's all these different things that we're going to look at in the following context. Many of these things are things that are brought on by other people in attempts to elicit some negative response from us, in some attempt to try to cause us to act in a way that isn't what God wants, and in such a way maybe get us separated from God's love. You remember Balaam told Balak, the way to get those guys to get in trouble, since I can't curse them, is to get God to curse them by sending your young women up there and essentially have them flirt with their men, and their men will get involved with their young women, and that will entice them to engage in sacrifices, and as a result, God will curse them. Well, there may be some people that think, we can do that with these New Testament believers. So the first one he asks about is, shall tribulation? Tribulation, it's adverse pressure. In fact, in this very book back in chapter 5, Paul has already said back here, this is chapter 5. He says, in verse 2, we have obtained access through him by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but we also rejoice or boast, this is a boast, in our afflictions, in our pressure. We go through pressure because we know that pressure produces endurance or patience. So he says, we boast in that. We don't look negatively at the pressure we go through in life. And I would understand this pressure largely to be pressure put on by other people. In fact, the first chapter of 2 Thessalonians, he actually says that there are people that trouble you or put pressure on you. Why? Well, they're going to in turn get pressure, but they're trying to, they don't like you. They don't like what you stand for, and they don't like your God. They don't like Jesus Christ. The next one is, if the word tribulation here, if our word tribulation is this word for pressure this way, The next word that's translated distress could almost be pictured as pressure this way. It's another term for going through something hard, stenochoria. And so he makes this statement over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This is after Christ tells him, my grace is enough for you. He says, therefore I am content, or literally, this Greek word over here, I think it's a good thing. I can have a good attitude in this, or a good opinion in weakness. And with arrogant treatment, that word insults, being treated arrogantly, and with that word troubles there, necessities that I'm going through, with persecutions, which we're going to look at in just a second, and with difficulties, being put in hard spots, being put in the press, as it were, things that just make life hard. And again, I would understand that probably in the context of Romans 8, that those are things that are being done by other people. Not necessarily, but because of the fact that he says, who shall separate us? And he could have used a neuter indefinite relative pronoun to say what, but he didn't say the what. He didn't say ti, he says tis. He's looking at who. Then the next one, when he's talking about this, persecutions, which we just looked at over there. Obviously, persecutions are clearly what are brought on by other people. That's persecutions. And Paul went through a lot of persecutions. There are a lot of times people, and in fact, interesting thing about the word persecution, it's a Greek word that meant to chase or pursue. And there are some places where there's a version of this word that is used in a good sense, but that same word in some other context plainly is negative. It's people pursuing, chasing you down. They don't have your best interest at heart. They want to chase you down and they want to do something bad to you in some way. And how about this next one? Famine, or simply being hungry. If you're going hungry as a believer, does that mean you've been separated from God's love? And famine, this is a very interesting fact. I don't know if everybody knows this. Famine is not always simply because the weather has turned bad. There's a lot of famines that go on around the world. Let's put it this way. There were a number of years ago that I knew of some believers in a different part of the world that they were experiencing a famine. And there were people that actually had provided for people in that country to receive food, but there were other people that controlled the supply from that, what was given to the people over here. Why? To control this population. And they did so to really control this population over here. And you'd be surprised how often that famines or making people go hungry is actually used as a means of manipulating people. And Paul, when he talks about hunger in this regard, I think is something interesting that Paul makes this statement. And this is in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He goes back up here. He says, well, let's just go back and read this, because a number of these things, we're going to have the word danger in a little bit, but he's looking at false teachers that are trying to say, we're just like Paul. And Paul goes, okay, are they like me, that I was 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and day I was adrift, free in frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers. And that's a violent robber there. There's another word for a sneak thief. This is a dangerous robber, a robber that would rob you from modern context, we'd say at gunpoint, at their day, probably by the end of a dagger or a sword. Danger from my own people, that is from the Jews. Danger from the Gentiles. Paul dealt with both of those. We can read him in the book of Acts. Dangers when he was in the city. Look at his early testimony, both in Damascus and in Jerusalem. Paul had to slip out at night because there were people in both those cities that wanted to kill him. Danger in the wilderness. So even when he wasn't in the city, but he was on the road, he came into trouble. Dangers at sea, and danger from false brothers. In toil and in hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst. There's a dangerous teaching in Christianity that if you do everything right, things are going to go well. But Paul says to the Philippians in Philippians 4, verse 12, I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. In other words, Paul says, I learned how to be content in either situation. And yet there are people today that think God wants us all to be rich, but Paul actually says he knew oftentimes what it was to be hungry, and not hungry because he was on a diet, hungry because he did not have access to food, because he was put in hard situations and wasn't provided for. And you'd say, God couldn't have provided? Yeah, sure, God could have provided for him. But Paul served, just as many, many Christians have through the centuries, serve an example of what God can do. So a famine or hunger doesn't do it. Nakedness. And nakedness doesn't mean that we're running around without any clothes. Nakedness can be as simple as the fact that where I am, our weather's starting to turn cold. And if all you have are a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops like you'd wear in the summer, you're going to be pretty miserable if you have to be outside in a day or two. Or in that same terms of nakedness, you don't even have a shelter, someplace to get in out of the cold. And Paul found himself that way a lot, where it was not uncommon for those people to travel, that they wrapped up in the robes and everything they wore at night and tucked their feet inside. And what if sometimes the robes that he had at that time were inadequate to keep him comfortable and warm? Or in danger, we just looked at a whole bunch of those dangers in 2 Corinthians, or sword. Sword kind of falls into this whole category of people that probably had the ability to wield a sword, so it could have been political in that regard, but not necessarily so, and how they would exercise that against him. And he says, are any of those things? And I would say behind all those, remember, it's who. So any of the people that are manipulating or causing these situations for Paul, or for us, or for any of us as believers, can any of those things separate us from Christ's love? No. And if we're going through any of those things, are they indicative of the fact that we have been separated from Christ's love? No. If you're going through hard things, if you're going hungry, if you're naked, it's not because you've been separated from Christ's love. It might be an opportunity that God's giving you to demonstrate something about Christian character, Christ-likeness, in the midst of sometimes very severe, very harsh realities. And when we can put that into our mind, because I can guarantee you, you may not go through all of these things, but at some time in your life, you're going to go through some stuff that's going to be overwhelming. I think it happens to a lot of us. And it's one of the things that if we don't have a good understanding of that we can end up lacking stability in our relationship to God and wonder if maybe our relationship with God is in jeopardy in some way. And yet if we keep that in mind, none of these things can separate us from the love of Christ. It'll help you. It'll encourage you in having a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.